So we start with today's lecture notes. Okay. So this is in fact page number 108, chapter 7 from your book. Okay. So the system theories, as you know, the translation theory is evolving and changing different as according to the different topics जो हैं आपके course outline में उसके according to हम चल रहे हैं. So here we move on to a very important like previous sorry पीछे आपने functional theories पढ़ी थी, other theories, and we talk about cultural impact and all that. Now we are talking about very important issue that what is this polysystem? ये system theories क्या कहते हैं? So in this particular, we are going to focus upon these two main theorists. Even the first is Ibn Zohar's polysystem theory, and then we are going to also move to Tory's. This is 1995. He put up a methodology for descriptive translation studies. We'll be doing these two prominent theories in detail. Okay. So let's see first of all that what the introduction is and what it's all about. Okay. In chapter 5 and 6, we saw how linguistics broadened out from static models in the 1960s to an approach which incorporates first scopus theory and then register and discourse. So we see that how from these chapters, initially in other chapters 5 and 6, static models of translation are in 1960s, and then we moved on to the functional theories. Remember, scopus theory and then register and discourse analysis. Round about in 1970s, like almost the last 3 decades of 20th century, it moved to the static prescriptive model. Say the translation studies moved on to polysystem theory. So we are going to look at what this polysystem theory is, which saw translated literature as a system operating in a larger social, literary, and historical systems of the target culture. So what this polysystem theory was that it saw all translated literature which have come up as a system which operates in the larger background. What is it? That any literary text which is translated, when we look at it, it's not that we are looking at the translator as something isolated. We are going to see that within the background, in the larger social context, in the literary context, in the historical system, where does it stand? He translated the text where it from the larger social concept में where does it stand? Where it is larger social context में कैसे है? If you're reading that literary text, उसकी translation देख रहे हो, because no text is written in isolation. No doubt, literature is written by people, by novelists and poets. But whenever they are writing something about the age of this, because you know about this famous saying that literature is a reflection of age. That means is any literary text which comes up, it reflects the age of which it's a product. By age means कि उस era में क्या था, what was the society, what social issues were there, what was the historical systems क्या थे उस जमाने में, क्या historical era था, what events were taking place and all this. So all of these, and culture, of course, culture is something very important, of that particular target culture with which it was a product of that. Okay. So this was an important move since translated literature had up to the point mostly been dismissed as, because up till the now by this polysystem theory was something very important, because up till this point translated literature को kind of एक second rate literature considered किया जाता था, or it was dismissed as something derivative. That means it's not original, it is derived from something. It's something as derivative, it's derived from something, it's second rate, it's second rate. So polysystem theory fed into developments in descriptive translation studies, a branch of translation studies that has been crucial in the last 20 years and which aims at identifying norms and laws of translation. So you have to see that this polysystem theory, as it is fed into development in descriptive translation studies, we have to see that it's a branch of translation studies in which have crept up, which have come up in the last 20 years or so, and it basically identifies different norms and different laws of translation. So in particular, developments in the study of norms were discussed, will be discussed later on in point 7.3, as well as we move on to other critiques given by on this system, on system theories, by manipulation, school, and others. Okay. So let's move on. First of all, that look at critically what polysystem theory is. This polysystem theory here, iske aage mein, we are going to study who was the propounder and who came up, who was the founding father of this particular theory. So polysystem theory was developed in 1970s by the Israeli scholar Itamar Ibn Zohar, borrowing ideas from the Russian formalists of the 1920s. So this polysystem theory was developed roundabout in the last 3 decades of 20th century, that is 1970s. It was developed by a famous, Israeli scholar by the name of Itamar Ivan Zohar, and he was influenced from the Russian formalists of the 1920s. You see, as writers, they get influenced from different theorists, different school of thought. So he was impressed by the Russian formalist school of thought in 1920s. And what he liked, what he was impressed was that the Russian theorists or formalists, they focused a lot. They thought that all literature, all literary writing is like literary historiography. So what does historiography means? According to the Russian theorists or formalists, it was that even literature is something, although literary writings, any scholar, any writer, creative writing, a novelist or a poet, when they're writing something, although it is like a fictional construct, fictional characters hote hain, but the bottom line, according to Russian formalists, was that whatever it is, it might be fictional characters, but it has based on this. You cannot take any literary context, apart from, or you cannot take it out from it. You cannot separate it from the historical background. In fact, जिस historical era age में वो लिखा गया, उसको आप you cannot separate it from it. The impact of that history, that era, is bound to be on that literary production. Any literary production which comes up, it will be affected, it will be a reflection, it will be a product of the historical age of which it's written. Okay. So literary work is here, not studied in isolation, but as a part of a literary system, which itself is defined as a system of function of the literary order, which are in continual interrelationship with other. So according to Zohar, he says that any literary work which comes up, you're not going to study it in isolation. It's not to be studied in isolation, but it's a part of it, belongs to as a part of a literary system, which you will define as a system of functions of literary orders, and which they are in a continual interrelationship with other orders as well. Okay, so literature will be just looked as thus as a part of a system. So any literature which comes up, you will see that it's a part and product of different systems. What are those different systems? For example, social system, cultural, literary, historical framework, and so on. Okay. So any novel, any short story, anything which you creative writing which you're studying, you are not going to study, you cannot study it in isolation. You have to see that it's a product of the society, social era in which it was written. It is a reflection of the cultural values of the society. It's a literary writing, no doubt, but it will also will have its root in the historical framework, in the historical era in which it was written. It cannot be, you cannot escape these things. And it's a key concept of all these systems when they join together. A literary piece of writing, social, historical, literary, we say that it belongs to a system in which there is an ongoing kind of a dynamic mutation. And if even it's a blend of this, it's a reflection of these systems, social, cultural, literal, historical. Yet again, we take them together as a system in which you see there is always a going on in mutation. What do you mean by mutation? उसमें changes हो रहे हैं. It's not dead. There is always an ongoing dynamic of mutation, change, struggle going on. And what is this struggle going on? That this text to be taken of prime importance, to be in a literary canon में, उसको जब ये सब systems within systems में उसको लिखा गया या translate किया गया, it should be of immense importance, and it should be like considered as a primary, get a primary position in the literary canon. So, although building on the work by formalists, even Zohar reacts against the policies of the traditional aesthetic approach, which had focused on high literature and disregarding an unimportant literary on genres. So, he says that although he was impressed by these Russian formalists, but even Zohar, he reacted very sharply on the policies which the traditional literature aesthetic approach was, and he said that it always had a focus on literature. So what was it? That it always focused on this higher literature, and disregarded as an कुछ literature कुछ categories के text जो translate हुए they were considered as high of high quality, that means high literature, whereas they disregarded other genres of literature as inferior or unimportant. For example, children's literature को unimportant consider किया गया, thrillers and other and so on. So children's literature was kind of considered unimportant, and thrillers and other type of genres was considered less important. Whereas there was some literature जिसको high quality या high literature considered किया करने जाना. And so, as a result, thrillers and whole system of translative literature. So, even Zohar emphasizes that literature operates as a system. So, according to Zohar, he emphasizes that all literature which comes up, it operates as a system. How? Number one, in the way the target language selects works for translation. So within that system, he says that in the way the target language it selects works for translation, that's one system. Then in the way translation norms, behavior, policies influenced by that. And in the other number of important point is that all translation, anything which is translation, you looked up at translation norms, you look at the behavior, look at the policies which are influenced. So you look at what is it in the way with the way these translation norms are taking place, and what is the behavior it's going on, and what are the policies which were influenced by the other core system. So even Johar focuses on the relations between all these systems in the overarching concept to which he gives the new term, the polysystem. So as a result, even Zohar, this Israeli scholar, he makes a kind of a relationship of all these systems, the systems which I've just pointed out, the social system, the cultural system, the historical system, and all that blend together in a together, and he talks gives it a new term as the polysystem. So, which a polysystem, according to him, is that any literary piece which is translated, source text हो गया, or translated version हो गया, it is always belong. It is like it's dependent upon it's a combination of different systems, and this he gives the name as a polysystem. Okay, so this was defined by Shuttleworth and Cowley later on, and I'm going to quote: the polysystem is conceived as a heterogeneous, hierarchized conglomerate or a system which interacts to bring about an ongoing dynamic process of evolution within the polysystem as a whole. So what it is that if you look at this polysystem, we see that this is a heterogeneous, a combination है, जिसमें कितने सारे systems काम कर रहे हैं. What are these different systems? I repeat again: the social, the cultural, the historical, all these, the spirit of the age in which that text was generated. So it is conceived as a blend of that. उसमें कितने सारे systems मिलकर काम कर रहे हैं. So it's heterogeneous, and on top of it is hierarchized. What does that mean? That within this system you see something of different stature. कुछ को हम higher hierarchy में रखते हैं, कुछ को हम lower में category, down the ladder, कुछ को हम lower consider करते हैं, कुछ को higher. So it was a combination of different systems, and within that system some are higher of hierarchy, some of them of low. So, or of a system which interact to bring about an ongoing dynamic process. So it brings about an ongoing dynamic process of evolution within the polysystem as a whole. How all these factors, as I say, a blend of different systems, and within that higher and lower, all blend together. It's a blend, a combination within the polysystem as a whole. So the hierarchy referred to is the positioning and the interaction at a given historical moment of different strata. So if you look at this hierarchy within a positioning to which is historical moment, and within a particular historical moment, different there was different strata of polysystem, कैसे वो emerge हुआ, and how literature emerged. If the highest position is occupied by an innovative literary text, then the lower strata are likely to be occupied by increasingly conservative. So within that polysystem, if you're talking about this hierarchy, that means कुछ को आप high stature देते हैं, कुछ को low देते हैं. So if within this system, if the highest position is occupied in a polysystem by such a text जिसको आप बहुत innovative समझते हैं, very creative, something new, totally new, you say that is something very, very innovative, literary type, or you give it as a highest position in this polysystem. And lower strata किसको दे रहे हैं, which you feel something conservative, something rehashed, something very commonplace, जो पहले भी something, there isn't anything innovative, something there isn't any element of newness about it. It's something conservative. Okay, so you place at the lower strata something conservative type, and at the higher strata, which is something innovative, something new, something literary style. So on the other hand, if the conservative forms are at the top, innovation and renewal are likely to come from the lower strata. So if we talk about within the system that आपने highest में top में innovative system को रखा है, but then it is and the lowest is at the lowest strata में the other way around लिखा है जिसको आप conservative कह रहे हैं. What it happens is that in this system of stagnation, a period of stagnation occurs. This dynamic process, because according to Zohar, this the Polish system is dynamic. This total stagnating system needs just constant flux है. There's a dynamic system, a system of change. It's a dynamic process of evolution. That means it keeps on changing, evolve हो रहा है. So it's vital to the because within the poly system, this is something very vital and important that it should be dynamic and it should be a process of change आते रहना चाहिए, stagnant नहीं होना चाहिए. So indicating that the relationships between the innovatory and conservative systems are in a constant state of flux and competition. So as a result in this system, as I said, is if you look back again, this dynamic process of evolution, it's vital to the Polish system, and in the relationship between the innovatory system and conservative system जो है वो भी एक state of flux है, एक competition में है. How it is in a state of competition? Let's see. Because of this flux, the position of translated literature is not fixed. Any translated literature की position आप fix नहीं करते. It may either occupy a primary or a secondary position. इसी वक्त एक translated text को क्योंकि system flux में है, change में है, तो कभी एक text वो text आपका primary position में आ जाएगा. Yet on at the other text would be like in a secondary position in a poly system. But if it is primary, it participates actively in shaping the center of the poly system. अगर वो poly primary में है, importance में है, तो वो participate करते हैं in a system of poly systems, and it is likely to be innovative and what innovatory, and it could be linked to major events of the hierarchy. So it is because it's primary innovative hai, so it is linked with other major events of literary history which are taking place at that point of time. So it often leading other writers produce the most important translation. As a result, such writers come up and they write up important translations, and they're a leading factor in the formation of new models for the target culture, and they introduce new poetics and techniques and so on. So even Zohar gives three major cases, comes up with three major cases when translated literature occupies, comes up with three, should I say, cases when translated literature occupies the primary position. So what is that three position? First is when a young literature is being established and looks initially to older literature. So according to even Zohar, she talks about that there are three major cases when translated literature occupies the primary position. So what is that? When it happens is that I'll go a little bit in the historical background of the age of colonialism to make this point clear to you, that during the heyday of colonialism, colonial period, I'll give the example of the way Indian subcontinent was colonized. And when it was colonized, India, as you know, subcontinent of India has always been a literate society, because by literate society is meant any society which has a word or written word जिसको document है, literature है, जो document हुआ है, written word which has been documented. And you're aware of, and you've studied, आपने history of language पढ़ी होगी, the Indo-European languages, and Sanskrit happened to be one of the oldest languages, when you trace the roots of languages, how they were evolved. So similarly, the written word, a lot of literature occurs in Hindi language, in Sanskrit, it occurs in Hindi, it is preserved in Persian language as well. So, when the Indian subcontinent was colonized by the British, they were amazed to see that this era, Indian subcontinent was rich, a literal society in terms of everything was documented and written and preserved. Okay, but at the same time, when other countries were colonized, say countries of Africa, Africa in particular didn't have a history of written word. उनका written literature नहीं था. Whatever literature for them was in the form of oral literature. या आप उसे folk tales कह सकते हैं, other kind of stories or fairy tales, stories and other and tales and everything and myths and mythology and everything was in the form of oral. उनकी history जो थी literature की orature थी. Orature means it was passed from one generation to another by word of mouth. Passed on. आप देखें nursery rhyme से लेके उनका literature, stories, उनके novels ले लें, उनके proverbs देखें, which were obviously based on years of wisdom, but everything was passed on from one generation to another through word of mouth because they didn't have a history of written were उनकी documentation written languages में नहीं थी in Africa. But only when Africa came under the colonial rule, when the British came in countries like Nigeria and others, and then obviously Africa was colonized by other colonizing powers like, should I say Spain, Italy, and then even France, like when it was and they brought with them the language, they imposed their own language, and the missionaries came, and then came this mission of educating the local population, making Orient to the Western education. Okay, so when they were exposed to Western education and Western languages, in case of Nigeria, basically English language, so they started learning, the African people, they, language of imperial center, English language, and so on. So as a result, in the post-colonial era, when these countries gained independence, just like India and Pakistan became independent in the middle of 20th century, similarly, Africa countries also got independence around about the same time period, like 1960s or early 60s and all that. So with Nigeria, I'll quote example is since they didn't have this history of written literature, so surprisingly, very eminent brains, intelligent writers came up from Africa, in particular from Nigeria. Maybe you're already familiar with the name of Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe, and whose first writing, Things Fall Apart, was published in English. Now, Chinua Achebe, the seminal work, his writing, his novel, which appeared, is written in English language, was this was something surprising because they didn't have any own, should I say, model नहीं था उनके सामने कि अफ्रीकन मॉडल था, नाइजीरियन मॉडल था जिसको कॉपी करके उन्होंने ये इंग्लिश में नावल पेश कर दिया, थिंग्स फॉल अपार्ट. No, that was not the case. Chinua Achebe and other African writers what they did was they looked up to older literature, older models, established literature models like English literature हो गया या European literature हो गया. Okay, so let me now with this background explain to you what this point number one is. So when a young literature is being established and looks initially to older literature for ready-made model. So this is where this African literature, Nigerian literature, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart would fit in, that as a young literature in Nigeria, जिनके पास कोई background नहीं था of written literature का, and when they started writing a novel produced किया Chinua Achebe, he looked towards the more established older literature, older models like the British literature for ready-made models. Okay, I hope this point is clear to you. The next is when literature is peripheral or weak, it imports other literary types, which is the key. Now this is again goes with the colonial era, that when the times when the British colonizers were colonizing and they were the colonizing masters, they considered that Europe was the center of everything civilization. उसको imperial center बोलते थे, imperial center, CENTER, and the other countries which they are colonized, be it the Indian subcontinent, or move on to what should I say, Malaysia and Sri Lanka, and you talk about Indonesia and in Africa, all these countries, they considered them as countries located far away in the periphery. क्या बोलते थे? That they are the countries who are located in the periphery, kind of, they are like in the kind of a backward area. They're located geographically in a backward area, and the imperial center was Europe. Europe was considered the imperial center कि जहाँ से literature emanate करते हैं, civilization and everything. And whatever literature, according to them, came up from these periphery, that means जो countries थी like subcontinent or towards the जिसको बाद में ये थर्ड वर्ल्ड कहने लगे, peripheral, ऐसे लिटरेचर को they branded it as weak and peripheral. And when this was imported, say for the sake of being translated, उसको always they considered it as something inferior. So this can happen when a smaller nation is dominated by a culture of larger. He says this policy can even happen by if a smaller nation would dominate culture by a larger country. Same is the case. Say that wherever the colonizers came, they claimed that their culture is superior, their religion is superior, their governance is superior, their way is superior, and the culture of the colonized is inferior, and so on. So this happens when smaller nations, when they were colonized, or they were dominated by cultures of the larger countries like the British, or well, like the British. And even Zohar sees that all sorts of peripheral literature may be consist of और as a result जितने peripheral literature थे coming from these third world countries उनको consist किए उनको they was considered as translated literature. So this happens at various levels. For instance, in modern Spain, smaller regions such as Galicia import many translations from dominant, and all these it was considered that countries in the periphery, like third world countries, they always have this literature which was imported to them, which is either translated or which is coming from the imperial center. Similarly, says that if you look in a country as Spain, and if you look at a particular province as Galicia, they would always importing translator coming from dominant space को जिसको dominant Spanish form को जिसको superior समझते थे, वहाँ से वो they accepted it as thing. And similarly, surprisingly, Spain itself, as a country, wanted to import well-established canonized literature, which was coming from English-speaking world. So, on the one hand, within Spain, remote provinces of Spain जो थे जिनकी अपनी native language थी, वो import करते थे कि स्पेनिश कैपिटल को और कैस्टिलियन को सुपीरियर समझ के उसको ट्रांसलेट करते हैं, उसको फॉलो करते थे. And whereas Spain, the country itself followed to even higher models and canonized literature, and it looked up towards British literature, okay, towards English literature, okay, fine. And the third is when there is a critical turning point in literary history at which established models are no longer considered sufficient, or when there is a vacuum in the literature of the country, when no type holds sway, it is easier for foreign models. So the third category it happens is that in a particular, excuse me, in a turning point in literary history, when it's considered that a gap सा आ जाता है, there's a vacuum, and it is considered that there's no literature in the country. So in that time, it is easier for foreign models आके they assume a primacy because आपको लगता है कि अपने native literature में there's a kind of a vacuum. Okay, excuse me for a moment. Excuse me. Okay, so now I can sharing the slide with you. So translated, it assumes a secondary position when it represents a parallel system. So any translate literature को अगर आप secondary position में लेते हैं, it is considered that it is coming from the parity within the polysystem. So it will have no major influence on the central system, and it will become like a conservative element, preserving conventional forms and conforming to the literary forms. Okay? So even Zohar points out that the secondary position is kind of normal for the translated literature, and then he considers stratified as well, and then he talks about some other kind of translated literature को secondary importance देने लगे in terms considering to major, and he quotes an example of Hebrew literary polysystem that within the times historically speaking, the time period between the two world wars, when it was basically considered that literature coming from Russia as something primary, उसको ज़्यादा superior समझते थे, whereas literature coming from England and other countries of Europe को secondary. So it changes times with times. This within the polysystem it might change. That in the Hebrew literary polysystem published between two world wars considered superior because when translations were coming from Russia, and whereas because Russians को primary समझते थे, whereas English and other European countries were considered as secondary. So even Zohar suggests that the position occupied by translated literature in polysystem conditions the translation strategy. So he said that within the position this translated literature occupies in a polysystem, it it conditions the translation strategy. It is primary. Translators do not feel constrained to follow target. So if it is primary, translators will not feel constrained to follow target literature models, and they're more prepared to break the conventions. Okay, thus they often produce a TT, a target text that is a close match in terms of adequacy, producing the textual relationships. Thus, it is in itself even then may lead to new source language models. On the other hand, if translated literature is secondary, translators tend to use within. So it is not a fixed thing. So on the other hand, if translated literature को अब secondary है, translators will need to use the existing target language models, culture for TT, and produce more non-adequate system. So the term adequate as such will be developed, when we move on to the next model in Tory system. So here we move on and see that what Gent Lisler stresses the very way the polysystem theory represents an important advance for translation. Let's see that he comes up and he says that there are certain advantages. He says that there are certain advantages in this system. Let's see what are the advantages. Number one, literature itself is studied alongside the social, historical, and cultural forces. So Gent-Lesser basically says that within this policy system, it's important that you look at the advantages and you see that there are certain advantages of this system. What are the advantages? You'd say that literature will be studied along with different criteria like social, historical, cultural forces. When you look up that advantages, you say that literature itself will always be studied along with this particular context. जो भी literature है उसके किस social background में वो emanate हुआ, what were the historically speaking epic, क्या historical events will take place, and cultural forces. Now let me point out in this example is that you see that even different eras in history, it has its impact upon the literature. Just you see that this 9/11 का जो event हुआ in US, United States, it had its impact upon literature, which specifically emanated in USA by, say, Muslim writers in particular, countries coming from the Islamic world. In particular, we look at our own Mohsin Hamid, the reluctant fundamentalist, उसकी जो किताब है, maybe you've read it, which he talks about his experience at how Muslims, and in particular Pakistanis and other nationality Muslims as well, how they were branded as terrorists and fundamentalists and what impact. So it happens that is that any historical event, it had its impact upon the literature. Similarly, let's not forget when Pakistan got independence, in 1947, पिछली century में, the whole impact of how in the partition, when the migration, this mass migration in which Muslims migrated from India to Pakistan, and then Hindus living in this part of which became Pakistan later on, they migrated and they went back to the main Bharat में चले गए. There's a whole Manto and other writers, and Jaswant Singh and so many writers who have written that what type of जब वो आपने stories पढ़ी होंगी कि when there was so much of massacre and what happened, the way trains were looted and women, क्या कुछ नहीं हुआ था. They were plundered, and the massacre took place, and there was so much of crime which took place. वो 1947 का dark age जो है, which is reflected and preserved by writers, both by Pakistani writers. They've preserved it. उदास नस्लें आप देखें, उर्दू की लिटरेचर में बहुत इसका preserved किया हुआ है. It's preserved by Betsy Sidwa does it, in her novel as well. So it is, another writers, Indian writers, Jaswant Singh ने अपनी writings में उसको उन historical facts को preserve किया. So any historical event which takes place, it's not forgotten like that. It is preserved. Any literature which emanated in that particular area, जो उस age के writers थे, उस history को जरूर document करेंगे in the form of maybe fictional construct, fictional characters हो जाएंगे, but the society, the social values, the cultural values, and historical events will be preserved and will be in the literature, which is a part of that age. Okay, I hope so. This is clear to you. So this was the advantage of this poly system कि वो किसी historical, किसी translation, किसी literary text को उस तरह फेस वैल्यू पे नहीं लेते दे से दैट इट हैज टू बी स्टडीड अलोंग आइसोलेशन में नहीं देखते दे हैव टू स्टडी अलोंग द सोशल हिस्टोरिकल कल्चरल फोर्सेस जिस एज में वो जनरेट हुआ ओके लेट्स मूव ऑन even Zohar moves away from the isolated study of the individual text towards the study of translation within cultural literary systems in which it functions. Zohar would also move on to individual text को study of इस तरह देखने कि culture और literary system में कैसे वो function कर रही हैं. And then the third is that the non-preservative definition of equivalence and adequacy, which allows for variations according to the historical and cultural situation, we look at that the non-prescriptive definition भी होगी equivalence की, which is preserved and which is reflected in that text. So the last point offers translation theory and escape from the repeated equivalent linguistic arguments that began to follow instantly the concept of equivalence in 1960s and 70s. However, we say that Gentleser, has some critique. He outlined some criticisms of the polysystem system. Let's see what was the criticism on that. Overgeneralization to universal. So what the first point was, he says that there's a kind of a overgeneralization in the universal laws of translation, which were based on the relatively little evidence. Kind of, he says, overgeneralization to universal laws of translation को base किया गया, which were relatively of little evidence, and over reliance on historically based. This was too much, according to Getleser, बहुत ज़्यादा over rely करने लगे historical background, historical based formalist model, which followed even Zohar's own model of evolving trends, and it might be inappropriate for translated text. And then the tendency to focus on the abstract model rather than, and then the tendency was to focus on the abstract kind of a model rather than the real life model, constraints placed on the text and translators. वो abstract चीज़ों पे कुछ ज़्यादा they focused on that. And the last was the question as to how far the supposed scientific model and to see that how far the supposedly scientific model was to be applied, how it was to be seen, was it really objective, the way it was done, how it was to be carried on, and all that. And it's really objective. And so, despite these objections, system theories had a profound influence. He said, in spite of these three objections given by Gentleser, overall, we say that this polysystem theory was no doubt important theory. It no doubt had a profound influence, profound impact on translation studies, and it moved it forward into less prescriptive, and it moved forward into kind of less prescriptive observation की तरफ चलने लगा of translate within the different contexts. It started moving. So despite these objections, we say that polysystem theory, जो भी इस पे objections थी, we still have to agree that it no doubt was an important, a profound theory, profound influence on translation study. इसका impact रहा polysystem का, because you see, we cannot deny history, historical fact, the cultural, other events which are on which a text takes place. So it helped, this profound, this polysystem theory, it helped to move forward into less prescriptive observation, and it moved on to the different contexts and so on and so forth. Okay. Class, this was, the today's topic, that is within system theories, the polysystem theory, which we have come to the end. In fact, the polysystem theory as evolved in particular, by even Zohar, by Itamar, even Zohar, and let's talk about, and he was the one who propounded and gave it the name or gave it the title of polysystem. Okay. So in our next class, I'll move on to Tory and descriptive translation studies, who also comes up under this polysystem or system theories के अंदर. इसकी भी important contribution है, Tory and the descriptive translation models. So we'll start with this topic, inshallah, in the next class, which we meet on Monday. And now